There's a conspiracy that we've been living in the wrong year, that a few hundred years of history were completely invented. Others claim ancient Rome and Egypt didn't happen when we think they did. And then there are the strange, out-of-place artifacts that seem almost impossible to place. These are disturbing discoveries in history that suggest someone altered the past. There's a theory that says we're not actually living in the year 2025. It's more like 1728, because about 3 centuries of history were completely made up. This idea came from a German historian named Herbert Illig, who claimed that between the years 614 and 911, nothing actually happened. Those nearly 300 years were supposedly added later by powerful people in the Middle Ages who wanted to rewrite the calendar for political and religious reasons. Illig believed the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, along with Pope Sylvester II, faked documents and adjusted the dating system so that their rule would line up with the year 1000, because it just had a better ring to it. According to his theory, figures like Charlemagne and entire wars from that time period were either exaggerated or completely fabricated. It's a fascinating concept, I guess, the idea that these guys just inserted hundreds of years into history and made up a bunch of stories to fill it with, but is this conspiracy true? It doesn't take things like eclipses and comet sightings into account, which line up perfectly with what modern science predicts. Tree ring data and carbon dating also show no gap here, and the quote-unquote evidence Illig used to explain why those hundreds of years didn't happen had a lot to do with what he saw as a lack of leftover architecture from the supposed phantom time, and a lack of written record as well. There are explanations for that stuff, but the major problem is it's very Eurocentric. There were civilizations all around the world who left more evidence behind from those so-called fake made-up years. So if someone did tamper with history, they'd have had to fake evidence from across every civilization on Earth. If you think the phantom time theory sounds extreme though, wait until you hear about Anatoly Fomenko. He's a Russian mathematician who decided that most of ancient history, Greece, Rome, Egypt, and the events in the Bible didn't happen when we think it did. According to him, everything before around the 11th or 12th century was either misdated or just made up. He calls it the new chronology, and in his version of history, a huge chunk of what we think of as ancient civilization actually took place much later, during medieval times. Fomenko argues that early historians copied bad data, reused stories under different names, and kept pushing events further back in time to make their own kingdoms or religions seem older and more important. According to him, religious texts like the Bible were rewritten in the Middle Ages to give authority to the church and create a fake ancient world. He uses astronomy and math to back this up, saying the numbers don't lie, but most scientists say his methods are just nonsense. Mainstream historians have completely rejected his theory, pointing out that old Chinese records, Muslim stories about kings and wars, and early American accounts all show events happening at different times than he claims. Basically, history from all over the world just doesn't line up with his specific version. Every once in a while, archaeologists dig up something that doesn't seem to fit where it's found. There's a name for it: out-of-place artifacts. Pretty apt. They're real objects that look too advanced, too modern for the time they supposedly come from. The most famous example is, of course, the Antikythera mechanism, a Greek device from around 100 BCE that worked like an ancient computer almost, predicting planetary movements with gears and dials. It's so complex that scientists still aren't totally sure how it was made with tools from that era. Then there's the Baghdad battery, a clay jar with a metal rod and copper cylinder that might have generated small electrical currents more than 2,000 years ago. Some people think it was used for electroplating or rituals of some kind, but it's still mostly a mystery. There have also been reports over the years of things like hammers or drill bits supposedly found inside ancient layers of rock, which, if real, would completely mess with the known timeline. Other than the Antikythera mechanism and the Baghdad battery, which are genuinely mysterious and very much do come from the time historians say they do, most scientists say a lot of other out-of-place artifacts either are just hoaxes, or the time they're said to come from is just misinterpreted. But they've still become fuel for people who believe history has been tampered with, because if even one of those objects really is from the wrong time period, it means someone or something had access to knowledge that shouldn't have existed yet. In 1912, an amateur archaeologist named Charles Dawson claimed he'd made one of the most important discoveries in human history. He said he'd found the missing link between apes and modern humans. Fossilized skull buried in a gravel pit in Piltdown, England. Scientists at the time were obsessed with finding proof that humans evolved in Europe, not Africa, so when Dawson brought them this skull, they kind of saw what they wanted to see. Top half looked human, the jaw looked more ape-like, and for over 40 years it was treated as real evidence of early man. Museums displayed replicas, textbooks rewrote parts of human history around it, but in 1953, new chemical testing exposed the skull as a complete fake. The skull was from a medieval human, the jaw was from an orangutan, and the teeth had been filed down to look more human. Whoever did it also stained the bones to look more ancient. But for decades, this fake discovery was being treated as fact. Someone had deliberately planted false evidence to rewrite history. The Tartarian Empire theory says there was once a massive, highly advanced civilization called Tartaria that got wiped from history. It started with old maps, where Tartary was just a region in Central Asia, but some people online then turned this into a story about a lost global empire. The main evidence comes from old buildings. People have looked at huge, fancy 1800s and early 1900s buildings and pointed out weird things. Doors that seem extra low, windows half covered by dirt, or basements that go way deep down. Believers say these buildings are the partially buried remnants of a much bigger civilization that was fully buried by a giant mud flood that destroyed the civilization. They also look at old photographs from the turn of the 20th century. Many show empty streets in big cities around the world. When people do show up, it's usually just horse-drawn carts or small groups of workers that are dwarfed by these, massive stone buildings. Tartarian believers see this as evidence that the cities weren't really built for the people in these photos. Like, the buildings came from some lost civilization that was more advanced than the street-level society that we see in those images. But any major city has poor neighborhoods that naturally stand out next to the huge fancy buildings around them, and historians, of course, say none of this is true. The streets were empty because photos back then had long exposures. Buildings look buried because the street levels changed over time, and Tartary was just a region, not some secret empire. Back in the 60s, staff at the French National Library found these odd documents that claimed to tell the story of a secret group called the Priory of Sion. According to the papers, this organization had been around since the Crusades, protecting the bloodline of Jesus Christ. The idea was that Jesus supposedly had descendants who later became French royalty. Authors ran with this story. There were documentaries about it, and before long, people genuinely believed the church had buried some huge secret about Jesus' real family. But then investigators traced the whole thing back to a man named Pierre Plantard, a Frenchman who'd secretly forged the documents himself and planted them in the library. By the time it came out that the files were fake, a lot of people had already bought into it though. The thing is, it all looked very official. It does make you wonder too if there are other pieces of history that are really just made up stories secretly slipped into the archives. Ancient Egypt is one of the most well-documented civilizations ever, especially when it came to their rulers. Aside from the ornate tombs, their names and legacies were also carved into stone. That's why it stands out when certain pharaohs just disappear. Take Akhenaten, for example. Around 1350 BCE, he did something no one else dared to do. He scrapped Egypt's entire system of gods and replaced them with one, Aten, the sun disk. He built a whole new city, changed the art style, and rewrote the entire religion. But then he died, and everyone tried to dismantle everything he'd attempted to do. His temples were torn down, his statues were smashed, and the records of his reign were rewritten to make it look like he never existed. And he wasn't the only one. Archaeologists have found other rulers with their names chipped away and replaced or missing entirely from official king lists. So basically, there was just a lot of editing going on in ancient Egypt. In 1883, a man named Moses Wilhelm Shapira turned up in Europe with a stack of leather strips he said had been found near the Dead Sea. He claimed they were part of an ancient version of Deuteronomy, with lines that didn't exist in any other known Bible. Some passages were pretty radical, like a version of the Ten Commandments with wording that changed the meaning of the law. Naturally, scholars were pretty suspicious about this. A lot of people called it a total forgery. Shapira was adamant though, and even let experts examine them in detail. But just as suddenly as they appeared, the scrolls vanished. Nobody knows exactly what happened. Some wonder if the scrolls were actually real, and someone decided they were just too controversial for the public to know about. Maybe some powerful person or group of people quietly removed them. There are sketches, copies, and notes from scholars who examined the strips, so we know roughly what was written, but the originals are gone. There's a story about a library supposedly built under the Kremlin in the 16th century by Ivan IV, aka Ivan the Terrible. According to the legend, it held manuscripts from rare Greek, Latin, and Egyptian texts. Some even say there were early Chinese texts held there. The idea was to gather all human knowledge in one place, but almost immediately after it was collected, it disappeared. People say Ivan had hidden rooms carved under the Kremlin with massive trunks stuffed full of these manuscripts, and only a few trusted people ever knew they existed. Over the years, a handful of stories pop up about parts of the library being found. Some say a group of workers came across a secret chamber, but by the time word got out, the books were gone again, locked away, or moved somewhere else. There's one story about a professor who copied a document describing the contents of the library. When he came back a few months later, though, both his copy and the original vanished. Basically, the idea is that there was this secret underground library filled with knowledge from around the world that may or may not still exist. It's kind of similar to the Vatican's secret archives, where a lot of people think there could be important documents or artifacts down there that are seen as too controversial or dangerous to see the light of day. With all that said, I've been your host James, and I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.